commander of Ukraine's land forces says Russia is concentrating its efforts in the eastern village of Avdiivka, which it took control of last month, as you can see there on your map. He says Russian forces are now trying to push towards several towns in the Donetsk region. Meantime, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron says there is incredible unity, his words, between NATO allies over Ukraine. It comes in response, if you remember, to a leaked recording that we were talking about just days ago, Fred Pleiken, between top-ranking German military officers on the country's Ukraine war strategy, which included details of British operations. Have a listen.
To all those in Germany and beyond and around the continent and around the world who want to see an end to this conflict, who want to see a peaceful settlement, who want to see peace on our continent, I absolutely agree, but you get peace through strength. You get peace by demonstrating that Putin cannot win. You get peace by helping the Ukrainians deliver what they need on the battlefield, because they are fighting for their country, which has been illegally invaded.
Let's get more on all these strands. Clare Sebastian joins me here in London with all the developments. And Claire, it is clear to see, at least we've seen today, we have been seeing for several weeks, along that kind of long, sprawling front line that the Russians are pushing, not just in the east, but also on the south. At the same time, we are seeing, and we've seen this on the show, a sense of growing unity from European leaders, at least talking now about the importance of upping the defence mechanism in Europe, in case of potentially a US election. Who knows? How do you see the developments that we've been hearing, what we've been hearing? Does that match what is happening in terms of what they're putting out in terms of ammunition?
Not yet, but there are plans afoot, right? There's a long-term plan which was agreed this week, 1.6 billion for sort of a joint defence industry plan. This is the first time the European Union has got together and come up with a sort of joint vision for its defence industry. That's long-term because it doesn't actually kick in until next year. But in the short term, they do seem to be coalescing around this Czech-led initiative to get ammunition from third countries, from outside the European Union, which has been somewhat controversial so far. France has now signed on to it. Norway today said it would donate $150 million or more than $150 million to that initiative. So there seems to be some movement there, and that would be fairly quick if it was to go ahead. But I think there is a sense also that David Cameron was emphasising unity today because there have been signs of disunity that Russia has picked up on. So we're talking about that leaked German phone call, which of course also mentioned British operations.
Macron.
Right, raising questions of trust between allies. Macron's comments on opening the debate on putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, which led to this sort of collective walk
we
back
saw that here on the show.
All of his allies. Russian media was quick to pick up on that. The farmers' protest, they're also picking up on partly over the lifting of trade tariffs on Ukrainian grain. So Russia is certainly picking up on all of this. But on the flip side, the rhetoric from Europe, it is stepping up. We do see a contrast between the as long as we can from President Biden in December and the likes of what we're hearing, for example, in a tweet from Ursula von der Leyen after that close call attack near President Zelensky on the Greek Prime Minister yesterday, saying, you know, we're now more than ever, we stand with Ukraine. So I think you definitely are getting that sense from European leaders, driven, I think, partly by developments on the ground and also by the deadlock still there in Congress.
Yeah, because it doesn't look like that Russia is on the offensive and Putin looks emboldened. And this plays well. I mean, the moves and the recapturing Avdiivka looks well to the population. He's got elections coming up. I'm not sure how he plays the unity of NATO, the fact that Sweden's now on board. You have been looking, you've lived in Russia, you speak Russian, you know the country well. You have been looking at the propaganda machine operating. What have you seen? How is it differentiated from over the years?
So it's it's stepping up at the moment because we're now in the third year of this war, which has been incredibly costly for Russia, and there is, in a way, there's nowhere to hide from that at the moment. So instead, they're stepping up the sort of anti-Western rhetoric. It's also stepping up ahead of elections. We're seeing a lot of image making from Putin. This, of course, partly because there's no debates, there's no rallies, there's none of the normal trappings of an election season. The Kremlin says that's because he's the incumbent, but ultimately, what we do see is that a lot of his very powerful propagandists are doing that work on his behalf on state TV. Take a look.
Flying into a fifth term, the roar of Putin's nuclear-capable strategic bomber almost as loud as the propaganda machine propelling him forward.
Владимир Путин на борту самого мощного, самого крупного, самого высокоскоростного стратегического бомбардировщика.
This is Putin's desired pre-election image. Strong, vigorous, calling the shots in his so-called special military operation. And letting his chief propagandists campaign on his behalf on state TV.
Он работает до поздней-поздней ночи, начинает работу утром. Мне просто хочется по-человечески спасибо сказать вот нашему президенту.
As we get closer to elections in Russia in March, we're seeing more and more of this more obvious propaganda. But there are also slightly more subtle tactics at play, and the most prominent of those is the constant scapegoating or even outright trolling of the US.
One popular talk show played this split screen on a loop. Putin boarding his bomber, Biden tripping up the steps of Air Force One. News reports on the war in Ukraine regularly showing off the wreckage of Western weapons. There's even a discarded Starlink antenna.
Привет, Илону Маску.
Boris Akunin, one of Russia's most popular modern authors, says the West needs to take note of this.
Putin benefits from this picture of the outside world as something hostile, so that people would unite around him. When the war started, a lot of Russians emigrated. Then they met with hostility. A lot of them had to return, and every single case has been used by Putin's propaganda to strengthen this idea that we are together, we are a besieged camp.
Alexei Navalny knew how to get around Putin's propaganda machine and its long-standing policy of ignoring him. From this cramped Moscow headquarters, which I visited in 2017, he and his colleagues beamed their message to millions of Russians via YouTube. And yet his death was something state media temporarily found itself unable to ignore. First discrediting his legacy,
Он был нацист.
then blaming the West.
А для них, ну, прям отличный тайминг. Впереди выборы. Поддержка у президента зашкаливает.
Finally, turning on his widow, Yulia.
Смотрели на жизнь королевы оппозиции за то время, пока вот он находился в тюрьме.
И когда через 2 часа после известия о смерти мужа жена выходит накрашенная, послушайте, ну, девочки меня поймут, даже тушь не потекла. Это вы умудритесь так.
For Akunin, Navalny's death is more than just a propaganda challenge. It signals propaganda may now be taking a back seat to a much blunter instrument of control, outright repression.
By killing Alexei Navalny, they lost the last chance of trying to pretend that they were legal, decent, law-abiding. Intimidation is now going to be the main instrument.
Obviously, the Kremlin has said that any accusations the Russian authorities were behind the death of Alexei Navalny, they've called those accusations unfounded. His spokesperson says that the medical certificate seen by his mother said the official cause of death was natural causes. And I will say that the propaganda machine, having had that burst of interest after his death, trying to discredit him and his widow, have gone back to basically ignoring his existence and certainly ignoring the crowds that we saw at his funeral.
Clare Sebastian, that fascinating piece. Thank you very much, Clare.